Colossal said they brought back the direwolf. Their own chief scientist then said the animals are gray wolves with 20 edits. Scientists called it the worst science story of 2025. And somehow, both sides missed the most interesting part. Because the real question here is not whether Romulus and Remus are direwolves. It is whether that question even has a clean answer. And it does not. And that is a much bigger problem than anyone is admitting. Part 1. The announcement. April 7, 2025. Colossal Biosciences goes public with 3 wolf pups. Romulus and Remus, born October 1, 2024. Khaleesi, born January 30, 2025. White fur, wide skulls, heavy builds. Living on a 2,000-acre reserve in an undisclosed location in the United States. The claim is simple and enormous. First de-extincted animals in history. The dire wolf is back. Extinct for 12,500 years. Alive again in a paddock in America. George R.R. Martin flew out to see them. He said it felt like the moon landing. The press ran with it. Every major outlet. Every science publication. The story was everywhere within 24 hours. And it felt historic. Because if it was true, it was historic. The process, as Colossal described it, was this. They pulled DNA from a 13,000-year-old tooth found in Ohio and a 72,000-year-old skull from Idaho. Reconstructed the dire wolf genome as completely as possible. Identified the genetic differences between dire wolf and gray wolf. Made 20 precision edits across 14 genes. Implanted the edited embryos into domestic dog surrogates. And 3 pups were born. At 6 months, the males weighed 80 pounds each. Projected full size was 6 feet long and 150 pounds. Bigger than any gray wolf alive today. Clean story, great footage, incredible claim. And within 72 hours, the scientists arrived. Part 2. The pushback. Vincent Lynch is an evolutionary biologist at the University at Buffalo. He did not hold back. It is not a dire wolf. It is misleading to call it that. He said he could not explain how angry it made him. That Colossal was still saying things they knew were not true. David Schiffman, an environmental scientist, agreed. This is a gray wolf that has had a tiny fraction of its genes modified to look more like what they think a dire wolf looked like. Not a dire wolf by any reasonable definition. The math underneath the criticism is hard to argue with. Colossal said the gray wolf and dire wolf genomes are 99.5% identical. That sounds close. But 99.5% identical still means 12,235,000 individual genetic differences between the 2 species. Colossal edited 20 of them. That is 20 out of 12 million. You are not bridging that gap with 20 edits. You are touching it. The IUCN issued a formal statement. The animals are neither dire wolves nor proxies of dire wolves. MIT Technology Review put the project on their worst technology flops of 2025 list. Not fringe criticism, institutional, consistent, loud. And then Colossal's own chief scientist said the quiet part out loud. Beth Shapiro, in an interview with New Scientist, described the animals as gray wolves with 20 gene edits. She said calling them dire wolves is a colloquialism, not scientific terminology. The woman who co-authored the 2021 Nature paper that established the dire wolf's genetic distinctiveness. The chief science officer of the company that built the pups. Publicly walking back the core claim in the announcement she helped put out 6 weeks earlier. From the outside, this looked like a company getting caught over-claiming. And in some ways it was. But the scientists declaring victory were skipping something. Part 3. What everyone missed. Here's the thing about the dire wolf that changes the entire argument. It was not closely related to gray wolves. Not really. A 2021 genetic analysis, the same one Shapiro co-authored, established that dire wolves diverged from other canids approximately 5.7 million years ago. They are genetically closer to jackals than to gray wolves. The differences are so significant, the dire wolf is classified in its own genus entirely, not Canis, Evolutionary, a completely separate branch of the canid family tree that happens to have arrived at a similar physical form through convergent evolution, which means the gray wolf and the dire wolf look similar for the same reason a shark and a dolphin look similar, not because they are closely related, because they both solved the same problem independently and arrived at a similar shape. So Colossal was not editing 20 genes in a close cousin of the direwolf. They were editing 20 genes in an animal that last shared a common ancestor with the direwolf 5.5 million years ago. Using a gray wolf as the starting point for a direwolf revival is a bit like using a dolphin as the starting point for a shark revival because they have similar body plans. The surface resemblance is real. The underlying biology is a different story. And here is where it gets genuinely complicated. If the direwolf was so genetically distant from the gray wolf that 20 edits cannot meaningfully bridge the gap, then the question the scientists should be asking is not whether Colossal miscounted their edits, it is whether the approach was ever going to work. Whether any number of edits to a gray wolf genome could produce something that biologists would accept as a direwolf. And the honest answer is that nobody has defined what that threshold would look like, because the species definition problem is not something Colossal created. It is something biology has been sitting with for 200 years and has not resolved. Part 4. The species problem. There is no single agreed scientific definition of what a species is. Not one. At least 26 competing definitions are currently in active use across different fields of biology. Each one draws the line differently. Each one produces different answers when applied to the same animals. The biological species concept says a species is a group that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Under that definition, Romulus and Remus are gray wolves. They can interbreed with gray wolves. The 20 edits do not prevent that. The phylogenetic species concept says a species is a distinct evolutionary lineage. Under that definition, the direwolf was a separate species, and Romulus and Remus, carrying a gray wolf genome, are not direwolves, regardless of how many edits Colossal made. The morphological species concept says a species is defined by its physical characteristics. Under that definition, Romulus and Remus, with their broader skulls and thicker coats and heavier builds, look more like a direwolf than a gray wolf. Whether that qualifies them depends on how precise the morphological match needs to be. 3 definitions, 3 different answers, all 3 in active use by working scientists. Lynch said, "You cannot put a mutation into a related species and call it the extinct thing." That is true under the phylogenetic concept. Under the morphological concept, it is more complicated. Schiffman said, "This is not a direwolf by any reasonable definition." But which one? He did not say. And that choice of definition is doing a lot of work in his criticism. Colossal should not have called these animals dire wolves in a press release. That is a marketing overclaim that caused real damage to public understanding of de-extinction science. That criticism stands. But the scientists saying these are just gray wolves are also making a choice. They are picking the species definition that produces the answer they want and presenting it as the only answer. And that is its own kind of overclaim. The debate about what Romulus and Remus are is not primarily a debate about the animals. It is a debate about which definition of species you accept as authoritative. And that debate existed long before Colossal was founded and will continue long after this story is forgotten. Part 5. What they actually are. So, what are Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi? Not dire wolves by the most scientifically rigorous standard. The original animal diverged from their starting material 5.5 million years ago. 20 edits address 20 out of 12 million genetic differences. That is not restoration. That is not even close to restoration. Not gray wolves either. Not in any practical sense. From their first days, they behaved like wild wolves, not dogs. Howling at 2 weeks old. Stalking behavior in their first weeks. Retreating from handlers who bottle-fed them from birth. Their skulls are wider than any gray wolf alive. Their vocalizations are different. Their behavioral profile does not match the gray wolf baseline anywhere researchers have looked. They are something new, a category that did not exist before October 1st, 2024. A gray wolf genome with targeted modifications, producing an animal that sits between 2 species, recognized as neither, legally owned as corporate property, ecologically homeless in a world that the original animal it is based on was built for and that no longer exists. That last part is the one nobody wants to sit with. Even a genetically complete direwolf, if such a thing were possible, would be walking into a world it was not built for. The megafauna it hunted are gone. The ecosystems that shaped it are gone. The competitors it lived alongside are gone. The world the direwolf evolved for ended 12,500 years ago. What Romulus runs through is not that world. It is the world that came after. Here is what both sides got right and both sides missed. Colossal built something real. The pipeline works. The animals are alive and healthy and behaviorally distinct from the baseline species in documented ways. The same technology has already been used to produce red wolf pups that could increase that critically endangered population's genetic diversity by 25%. The practical outcomes are genuine, regardless of what you call the headline animals. The critics are right that calling these animals direwolves is scientifically inaccurate. They are not. The overclaiming caused real harm to public understanding of what de-extinction can and cannot do. A politician cited the direwolf announcement in a congressional hearing to argue that gray wolves should be delisted from the Endangered Species Act. That is a direct policy consequence of a marketing claim. That matters. But the critics are wrong to treat the species definition question as settled. It is not settled. It has not been settled for 200 years. And the direwolf debate exposed that gap more publicly than anything before it. If the science community wants to say Colossal failed to meet the bar for de-extinction, it needs to define where that bar is. In writing, with specific thresholds, in a form that could be applied to the next program and the one after that. That definition does not currently exist, and producing it is probably more important work than arguing about 3 wolves on a reserve in America. Romulus is fully grown. He is running a 2,000-acre reserve with his siblings. He is something the world has not had in it for 12,500 years, in some form, in some sense that is real, even if it is imprecise. What biology calls him is a problem for the textbooks to sort out. He is not waiting for the answer. If the question of what we owe the species we have already permanently lost is what keeps you watching, our last video asks the hardest version of that. Watch, did mammoths ask humans not to kill them next? 30,000 years of coexistence. Cave paintings of individual animals drawn with extraordinary care and detail. And a final population on Wrangel Island that survived 6,000 years without us, until we found them.